Hi, in this episode of Change Talk, we're revisiting the topic of most significant change, a participatory story-based approach to evaluation, which I've been using and supporting others to use for about 8 years. In episode one of Change Talk, we heard from Mark Robinson about how he had used most significant change, or MSC as we call it for short, in the arts and cultural sector. Some listeners said they wanted to know more about the nuts and bolts of MSC, so I decided I'd spend a second episode drilling into the topic. Nick Andrews has been using and delivering training on MSC throughout the social care, health, and voluntary sectors in Wales, and I was delighted when he agreed to join me in conversation. Nick's a former social worker who's been delivering the DEEP initiative, that stands for Developing Evidence-Enriched Practice, at Swansea University. He's been doing that since 2013. In the podcast, we begin by defining and describing the practical steps of MSC. We reflect on the benefits and limitations of using the approach. And we also spend some time talking about story discussion panels and how to facilitate them so as to maximise real-time learning and change, or as Nick puts it, how to go from being moved to moving. Fantastic. So I'm delighted to welcome Nick Andrews to this episode of my Change Talk podcast. And today we're going to be talking about most significant change. So without further ado, should we just start off by explaining to anyone who isn't familiar with the approach what most significant change is, Nick?
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, most significant change is a story and dialogue approach to learning-focused evaluation. And the emphasis to me is on the learning-focused evaluation rather than performance-focused evaluation. So much evaluation is, but it's definitely, it doesn't do away with performance evaluation, but the primary focus of MSc is around learning-focused evaluation, which I think is a healthy environment to go into, because the minute it's performance-focused, you end up gaming, don't you? So.
Absolutely. In fact, I was just reading a blog somebody reflected on only the other day about how, particularly in the charity world, we've got pushed further and further into kind of performance related evaluation, and we end up kind of trying to extract positive PR stories from people, and
Yeah.
end up kind of moving away from that learning approach. So most significant change is a structure that we can use to bring us back to that.
It's interesting you say about performance because sometimes I hear people sort of be critical of MSc and say, oh, it's cherry picking the nice stories, really. It's always the positive stories. But of course, MSc is not just about the positive stories, it's about the difficult and challenging stories too. And we've worked with child protection and social work involvement in domestic violence. And some of the stories, of bad experiences, and they are as significant as the good. So it's a balance of the good and the bad,
That's really
but the
important.
main focus on learning
That's
from
really
both.
That's great. So, do you just want to walk us through, what the kind of, how you would go about doing most significant change, what the kind
Yeah.
of practical steps are, and then we'll come back a bit more to think about the benefits.
Well, the first thing is it's about gathering stories from people, and because it's about gathering stories, you've got to be very sensitive how you do that. So the first thing I say about MSc, it's not like getting people to fill in an anonymous survey. You're asking people to share a story, so that's personal. So we always say MSc, well, any kind of story really belongs to the storyteller.
Yeah.
So whenever we approach the methodology with people, we always say we want to gather stories and learn from them, but you will always be in control of what happens to the stories. So you don't just grab the stories and run. So
Yes.
there's all the ethical considerations. And so we're quite keen that we produce an information sheet and a consent form
Mhm.
and really get people to understand what they're sharing and who it's going to be shared with and everything. So that's the first, it's the foundational bit.
Yes.
And then the next part of it is quite straightforward, really. It's just saying, and it's asking an open question.
Mm.
Oh, sorry, it starts actually with a bit of background, I suppose, because the thing with MSc stories is you might be an interviewer, say, gathering an MSc story, and you might know the person.
Mm.
But the stories tend to go to, and we'll talk about this later, they go to a story selection panel.
Mhm.
And these can be people who haven't got a clue who the person on the is. So you need a little bit of a pen picture. So this is an older lady. I'm an older lady. I live in southwest Pembrokeshire. I attend a knit and natter group every Tuesday, and this is my story. So only a little, but you need to frame
Yes.
whose story's being told. And some people would like to go into more detail in that than the others. Yeah. So when we've worked with parents who've had quite traumatic backgrounds, they like to really set the scene for the story.
So really important that we get that kind of context so that somebody reading the story really understands who this person is and how they fit into whatever it is we're trying to evaluate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So once you've got that, first of all, you've got the consent. People understand what's happening with their stories. They've got control over their story, where it goes, and then you start the story gathering, and it starts with that pen picture, a bit about this is my circumstances, this is how I came to where I am now. So once you've done that, then it starts with this lovely open question. And you can narrow the question in if you want to, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it starts with this very open question. So, for example, say you've been involved with social services for the last 6 months. You can ask the very open question, thinking back over the last 6 months, what good or bad changes have come about as a result of your involvement with social services? So, and then you let people unpick what's changed. And it can be changes in them. It can be psychological changes. It can be attitudinal changes, emotional changes, financial changes. It can be anything really. It can be changes in them. It can be changes in other people, my children, my parents, the nurses who come in, whatever. So it can be changes in other people. It can be changes in communities. Changes like there's a new group set up and we do this and we do knit and natter, whatever. So it can be changes in communities and organizations. It can be changes in organizations. It might be a change paperwork. The paperwork is less bureaucratic now or whatever. So you let people tease out those different changes.
So really,
And
that's
ideally,
non-leading, isn't it? It's,
it
we're
is
not kind of
non-leading.
saying, tell us
No, just
about your paperwork, tell us about your family. It's completely opens that up, doesn't it?
it is open. And sometimes some people need a bit of help to think, well, about change. So I was doing an evaluation of co-production in Swansea, and there was an older guy there, and he said, "Well, I don't know why you're asking me for a story because nothing's changed. What's the point of doing a most thing change?" And I said, "Are you sure nothing's changed?" He said, "No, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed." I said, "What about your attitude?" "Oh, aye, that's changed." He said. And then he went on and he produced this beautiful story, you see. And he said, well, what it was like before. So he explained how he'd been 12 months ago and shared and no feedback. He basically created a lovely, powerful story, which was very useful for the people intending to do co-production, really. So sometimes people need little prompts from the interviewer. Are you sure nothing's changed? And because, again, it's getting people to think and reflect.
Yeah, yeah.
So ideally, then you have a series of changes, and it can be 5, it can be 10, it could be 3. I don't know, but usually you have more than one change. And if asking that original question, you're keeping it quite open, you can narrow it down a bit. So, say you've got funding, you're a third sector organisation, you've got funding to build relationships in communities. Then you can refine the question. You can say, okay, looking back over the last 6 months, what good or bad changes have come about in your relationships as a result of the? So you can narrow your question down. So you've got to shape your question according to what you want to find out about, really. I like it, keeping it really open, because when you keep it open, you get all those unexpected outcomes and changes, and which are often really powerful, the emergent outcomes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So
And yeah, I think that's that balance, isn't it, between having those kinds of topics in mind, some of the outcomes that you're driving at in that project, but
yeah,
also creating enough space for people feels really, really important. Yeah. Uh,
yeah.
I'm just wondering when you're kind of collecting that story. I know, some of the criticisms that have been levied against that kind of story collecting approach are around, I suppose, that sense that we're almost expecting people to be at the end of their story. Is there some, how do we avoid putting pressure on people to kind of say, and now I am completely, my life is
Oh no, you never do that.
completely
No,
solved. How do you sort of
no,
get
because
that balance?
it's not about your whole life story. It's about that window of,
Mm,
because you say over the last of your life, and
mm,
where
mm.
are it's not such a, it's basically targeted on that period of time.
Yeah.
What's changed? So, and it doesn't mean things won't change again. And again, our work showing that,
Mm,
where they've had one round of MSc story gathering, then we've moved on to phase 2 of story gathering. So They're like chapters, aren't they, really, of a book, rather than a sort of the final perfect sort of solution. That never happens, does it, in life?
I like that. So
There's
we're in the moment reflecting on a very focused period
a period
with,
of time.
an
Yeah,
open but specific question. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. So once you've got a list of changes, the next thing, and this can be challenging for people, is you post them. You say, okay, you give me 5 changes there. Which is the most significant to you then, and why is that? And you see some people look at you like, I've never thought about that. Yeah. They've never had time to reflect.
Mm.
So it's really nice. They say, well, have a think about that. And they go, well, I don't know. I suppose it's my confidence, isn't it? And then they'll pour out, they'll say they've picked one and they'll say it's this.
Mm.
And why is it significant to them? Well, it's really significant to me because I was, before it leads into the rest of the MSc question, really. But basically, they'll say why it's significant to them. So then once you've got this lovely, it's really personal, you see. That's what I like about MSc stories. They're not like case studies.
Mm.
Case studies are about people. And the minute you're doing case studies about people, there's a real danger you're interpreting their story.
Yes.
Mrs. Smith goes to the library, and the best thing since sliced bread is because she can walk now instead of taking the car. That might not be what was significant to Mrs. Smith at all. It might be a friend she'd made at the group. You see, so it's always first person stories by people, not third person stories about people,
Yeah.
and that's a really important thing. So, and also first person narratives are really powerful for the panel because people respond differently to first person stories than they do to third person. It's
Yeah.
the way the brain works. So, so basically, and they go, well, okay, it's that, and that's why it's significant to me. Some people question you, and they'll say, what do you mean by significant?
I was going to say that comes up a bit, doesn't it? And how do you answer
I'll
that,
say,
Nick?
well, that's for you to decide, isn't it? Really, again, you put the ball in their court, which is lovely and empowering because so often when people are being evaluated, they're fitting into a well-being scale, or they're ticking a box or an outcome star, and it's a bit stressful. But you're not. You're saying no. You say what's significant because that's what it's about, really. We want to know. You might be a practitioner in a hospital. I don't care what the management say. What's significant to you when they've changed the ward, and moved the beds around or something. So it really is putting the ball in the court. It's very respectful of people.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So once you've got that, you say, okay, well, now thank you for sharing that most significant change and why it's significant to you. Can you tell me a bit then about what it was like before? What's it like now? And what was it that brought about the change? So this is another really important bit. So they'll say, well, before it was like this, and I used to do this, and it used to really annoy me that I did this and this, and now it's this, and I do this, and I'm much happier. And then another key thing is well, what made the difference? And you might think, oh, it was my training, wasn't it? It was my training. They really liked me. And they'll say, no, I was down the shop one day, and the woman in the shop assistant said to me, she said, I thought, that's right. And I thought, that's just so the trigger for the change might not be one that you think it is. It can be something else. So, like if you're an activity provider in a third sector organisation, you think it's your activity, but it's not. It was finding out that the person next to them had a dog, and then they got talking about a dog. And do you know what I
That's
mean? It's that sort of
Yeah, and that's such an important part, I think, from an evaluation point of view, because we're obviously always in this, how do we sort of actually attribute cause and effect, aren't
attribute
we?
contribution. Yeah,
And in this model, we're asking the person, aren't we? What
yeah,
what do you think actually created this
yeah.
change for you? And as people then providing a service or thinking about how we improve services, that's really key learning, isn't it? Because if
It
it
is.
the fact that they got chatting to somebody next to them and then we need to make sure we're facilitating spaces where people can find out what about the person sitting next to them and make those
Yeah,
relationships, don't we? And perhaps be a little bit less over focused on our training or whatever it is, the
or our
intervention we're
policy. We
delivering,
might have to take it on the chin that it wasn't our grand new policy that influenced the staff speak. It was just letting the staff get together in a room and have a chat with one another. Yeah,
Absolutely.
nothing to do with the policy or the strategy. So,
Yeah.
so that you can see, it's very much the ball's in their court.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I'll come on to that later with the benefits of it. But when you put the ball in the court of the other person, that's in inverted commas therapeutic,
Yes.
because you're respecting people, you're listening to their story, you're letting them lead the conversation,
Mm.
you're giving a framework for them,
Mm.
but you're letting them fill in the rich narrative, really.
I think
Mm.
that's really important about the framework actually, because I think people sometimes when you invite somebody to come
Mm.
and meet you or to give a story, there can be a little bit of fear there, I think. I mean, we do communicate in stories, but if somebody suddenly asks you to tell one, it's a bit stressful, isn't it? You think,
Yeah,
oh,
you think, oh, I've got to
I've
be
got
good.
anything
Yeah,
interesting enough, and how's it going to come out? And the structure that you've just described, walks people through that in a very safe way, doesn't it? So they
yeah.
barely realize that they're telling a story. You're kind
That's it. They
of
barely
work it
realise.
up.
Yeah. So yeah. So and the last bit of that, the story you say is okay. That's a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing that. All good stories have a good title.
Hmm.
Can you give your story a snappy title? And some people laugh. They go, "Oh," but it's nice. Again, it's respectful. Saying your story's important. All good stories have a title. Can you think of a title? And what I find is people enjoy this part. They like to come up with a creative title because people are intrinsically creative, aren't they? Human beings. They love it, and they'll come up with a snappy title, very personal.
Hmm.
I'll give you an example. Um, Gemma, a parent involved in child protection, and had kids taken off her and the likes, and she joined a parent advocacy network and really has come through and become a real leader in terms of parent advocacy and building better relationships with social services. So, but she put her title was to be continued because that was a line out of a story. This is a story to be continued. But as well as giving the title to be continued, we say, "Oh, do you want to pick a Google image, something off the internet that illustrates your story?" And she went through the scrolling down, and she picked a Looney Tunes one,
Ah,
to be continued.
nice.
Because that's like my family, she said. It's like it's like real Looney Tunes, really. It was lovely. So it's
Yeah.
really personal. So you get people to put their own late mark on the story, and then this is important as well for the panel because when you get the panel later on, we'll see if you just have stories as written text and you're asking people to decide which one is the most significant, which again I'll talk about later. If they all look like a pile of words on the floor spread out around a room, was that the one about the dog? Was that the one about the woman with the tulip bulbs? And but if you've got a picture and a title, you go, oh, I know that one. Yeah, that's the Looney Tune. That's the mother, isn't it? Yeah, so you see what I mean. So they're getting the title and the illustration to format the picture story is important for the panel because you want to make that a enjoyable process for the panel. So that's it. And in terms of gathering stories, people don't just pour out a perfect story, rarely. So what we found is there are three sort of broad ways of gathering the story. One is the individual interview. When you have your phone switched on or your voice recorder, you go through the questions. You'll need then, as a story gatherer, to edit the story down, not changing the first person nature of it. I mean, very careful how you edit, but just tidying it up a bit. And then you have to go back to the person and say, I've done a bit of tweaking and trimming just so it flows. Is this the story? Is this your story? So you double check it with them. So that's the normal way of doing it. And again, in some organisations, we found they have a designated story gatherer. I think that's really nice because you get a nice set of stories that it works well for the panel, and there's a consistency in terms of the way the stories have been going. Other people have said we haven't got the capacity for that, so people gather stories from different people, gather different stories.
Yes.
That produces a more eclectic mix. But you still use the stories, but of course, they'll never be the same
Mm.
structure. It depends how tidy you like it. But the other thing is what we found with the parents who had the kids taken off them, and they're a peer network. They said we don't want the individual interview. Thanks very much. We'd like to do it as a group activity.
Oh, okay, interesting. How did
So basically, the parents sat in a circle around a table. I
Mhm.
think we had 7 parents and 3 social workers who've been involved in parent cafes and the parent advocacy network. And they took it in turns to ask the questions. And the parents would ask the questions of the social workers as much as the social workers would ask questions of the parents. So
Mhm.
it was a holy place, honestly. It was therapeutic. You were there and you could see people empathizing when they were listening and they were attentive to each other,
Mhm.
sharing their story. So it can be a very rewarding story gathering to do it in groups, really. And to me, that's not again. I'm going on to about the benefits, but it's one of there's joy in the journey as well as the destination. There's something about the way you do it is whether you do anything with the stories or not. There's
Yes.
benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. That
Yeah.
chance to both for individuals to reflect, but for groups to really
Yeah.
actively listen to each other's
Just
reflections.
listen to each other. Listen to them tell their story.
Yeah.
Oh, same in mental health. Really powerful.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
that's it, really. So there's your story gathering process.
Yeah.
And then now, what you can do, if you're a really busy organization and all you're interested in is having qualitative evidence of impact,
Mhm.
you can sit lovely Imogen Blood in a cupboard for 2 weeks with 30 stories and a marker pen, and she can do thematic analysis. So you can do that. You can do the thematic analysis, but that's not what MSc is primarily about. It does do that.
Mm.
So say you gather 30 stories, it's good to get someone to thematically analyze those, and you can produce a qualitative report based on that, So that's good. But what MSc is because it's learning focused evaluation and it's participatory learning focused evaluation. So basically, what you want to do is you get a group of people, key stakeholders, and ideally including decision makers,
Mm.
people in power
Yeah.
who've got some sway over what's going. They can be funders, they can be commissioners, or organisational managers, trustees,
Mm.
and you give them a selection of the MSc stories. And again, people get twitchy about this. You say, "Oh, is this biased?" You pick all the nice stories and discard the other ones. So 30 stories, 24 are terrible, 6 are good. You give the 6 good stories to the panel to. No,
Mm.
there's got to be an integrity in what you select. The idea of the panel is you just select a range of stories that cover a range of things. So if there are 3 stories about the benefits of hugging trees, whatever, then you don't really want 3 of those stories. You might have one,
Yes.
really good, but then you'll have another one about some other aspect. And you might have a man's story, you might have a woman's story, a young person's story, an older person's story, a practitioner's story, an unpaid carer's story. So the idea is to create a rich selection of the stories as
Yes.
representative in as best as possible.
Mm.
And really, the panels, which consist of, I find, about 10 to 12 people,
Mm.
a story selection panel, 10 to 12 people is ideal.
Mm.
They can only really cope with 6 to 8 stories, really. Anything more than that, it gets a bit overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what you do there is you've got your selection of your say 6 stories for the panel of key stakeholders, and then you set them a task. This panel, you say, okay, I'm going to share 6 stories with you. We're going to explore each in turn.
Mhm.
We will explore, and we want you to say what's significant. We want to explore what's significant in these stories, in terms of what we're doing, what we're about. But we'll explore each in turn. But then what I want you to do is decide which is the most significant story.
Mm.
And you
Mhm.
see some people go, oh, can't do that. They'll all be good stories, won't they? And I say, yeah, they are all good stories. And then some people say, well, won't it upset the people who don't have their story picked as the most significant story? Because again, they've got this mindset that it's like the Booker Prize. You know, this is the best story.
Yes.
That's not the aim of the panel. So that's the key thing I get across to the panel is all of the stories are equally important.
Yes.
There'll be different. What we want you to explore is the significance in the stories,
Mm.
and start to wrestle with what do we mean by significant. This story is very significant because it's about outcomes. Is it right? Well, this one's very even more significant because it's about relationships. Well, but aren't outcomes more important than relationships? Well, I don't know. What do you think? So it's to get people exploring and stretching each other. So they
Mm.
have to argue with each other. And I'll explain later some of the way we structure the panel. But basically, they have to argue nicely together, explore the significance in all of the stories, and then decide on one which is the most significant story.
And that
But
really
once they've
flushes that out, all of that, doesn't it? Really? Yeah.
does. But the way I normally do it is explore each story in turn, then place the stories on the floor if you're doing it in person.
Mhm.
But you could do it in online as well, using a Mentimeter or something. But you put the stories on the floor, you explore each in turn, sat in a circle.
Mhm.
Then you spread them on the floor and you say, okay, go to which one you think is the most significant, and off they go. And everyone will go to different stories, and then you start the conversation. Well, you're here, Imogen. Why do you think this is the most significant story? And
Mm.
you'll say, well, I think it's the most significant story because of that. And that's very interesting. Anybody want to question that or challenge that? No. Anybody got a different perspective? Then you move on to the next story. Why are you on this one? And I'm on it because of this reason. And so you get the conversation going. It's this dialogue learning, really, you're trying to get going. Yeah.
Mm.
And a key thing about this, and this is another important thing about the MSc, it is participatory evaluation. So it's a group of people evaluating, searching for significance, what's going on in these stories. But more equally importantly, it's about getting to understand each other. So when Imogen says, I think this is the most significant story because, then as well as learning about the story, and I'm learning about Imogen. Oh, so that's what makes Imogen tick. I always wondered why when I sent her an email about that, she never did anything. And it's not, doesn't tick her boat, whatever. And that Anne Edwards in Oxford University calls common knowledge, which is understanding where other people are coming from.
Right.
And this is such an important thing in interprofessional working or team working or co-production, where we actually understand the motivations and the values of other people in the room. So I say the story selection process has two benefits. It has the learning from the stories, which is the obvious one, but then it's also about learning about each other, and it's about building relationships. So it's much more than evaluation methodology. It's a community development.
Yeah, brilliant. And I want to come on in a bit to reflect a bit more on that kind of, I suppose, those sort of transformations that can happen in real time as part of this process.
Oh,
But perhaps before we get on to that, I mean, the two questions may overlap, but let's just think a little bit about sort of when and why you might use MSc and what the benefits are of that.
well, the first person I always go to is Ian McGilchrist. I don't know if you know the neuroscientist.
I know the
He's a
name.
very clever man, really, and brings together physics and philosophy and neuroscience and stuff.
Mhm.
And he says the world is going the wrong direction, really. And he talks about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The brain, we have two brains essentially, really, and the left is for manipulating, dissecting, measuring. The right is embracing with the world as it is, really, which often includes mystery, beauty, uncertainty, nuance, all those things, which are the arts obviously lean beautifully to. And he says the rationalist world, the new public management world, which is driven on performance and tick box metrics, likes the to break everything down into component parts and pieces. And what Ian McGilchrist says, you can't really do that. You can't take someone's life and pull it to pieces like the components of a bicycle, because when you do that, it's like taking notes out of music. It becomes meaningless. Or you take the heart out of the body, it dies. So you have to look at things as a whole. So one of the key things, I think, when you're talking about changing lives, some of the methodologies I've seen around measuring changes in people are reductionist. They're like they take someone's life, which is like a beautiful poem about, say, grief and loss, a fond kiss, and then we sever, a farewell and lasts forever, whatever. Beautiful, and they turn them into banal statements. It's really tough when people you love die. It's like, and you lose the person by dissecting the person. You've lost it, and the same, and also complexity in organisations. When you try to pull everything to pieces, you only see. You need to see the whole thing, really. So your organisational stories, people can get their head around organisational stories better than they can everything being sort of chopped to pieces, really. So when you would use it, to me, is where you're working in complexity. And of course, I think in most public services,
You are all
that's
the time. Yeah.
welcome to the world
Yeah.
where, where everything isn't linear and predictable. Because the other thing, I used to be a planning officer for Swansea Council, and they love logic models. You know, these are the outcomes we want to achieve. And these are the steps to it. And it's a bit like baking a cake, isn't it? Like making a nice or making a lasagna. You do your steps, and it's complicated, but as long as you follow the steps, you end up with nothing quite like the book, but you end up with a reasonable lasagna, don't you? So, but of course, when you try that in the world of planning and evaluation, it never goes like that, does it? It's more like a football match. So in a football match, you can never guess. You can never say at 20 minutes into the game, player 11 is going to kiss the ball to player 9, and we'll have it all tied. You'd have to just keep your eye on the ball as you go along. Well, MSc, that's what it's about, really. It's about much more important. I mean, have a plan, a theory of change, but more important is to do something. Do something, and it'll create all sorts of complex ripples and patterns. Let's look backwards, and we'll gather the stories of change. So it's embracing complexity. It's more action focused and looking back rather than spending all your time because like strategies, I've done them for years. You do a strategy, and by the time you've finalized and printed it and everything, it's ready for the next one. You think we need a new strategy. I think no, we just need to do something, and we need to see if it's making a difference, don't we? So
Yeah.
I've probably laboured that a bit, but it is really
No,
important. So,
it's really, really interesting. So we've got this kind of structure in which we are democratically and leaning into all the different diverse insights that all those people that are involved in that process
yeah,
as storytellers, as panel members are bringing. And we're doing a sort of, I mean, there's real elements of action learning there, aren't
it
there?
is. Oh,
Like
it is. It's an action. Yeah,
take action and then let's kind of reflect. Action obviously, as you say, against we've got some sense of what we're trying to achieve at the start. We've got our
yeah. You don't not just
objectives, of course.
working blind. No.
Yeah, but we set off on a journey and we kind of at regular intervals
Yeah,
really stop to monitor it in a very sort of holistic relational
holistic
way.
way and a relational way. So the one thing is around that holistic evaluation, really, and it's embracing complexity. And stories are the best way to do that,
Mm.
and dialogue. So, but then the dialogue also is about this building relationships. So if you're trying to do co-production or you're wanting to support interprofessional working, then I'd say MSc is great for that because, especially to give the example of interprofessional working, when you bring social workers with nurses and they often have different perspectives, and I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong, the social model and the medical model, and because they're not, everyone will have equally important and valid perspectives. So, but then think then, well, I'd love them to be in a panel. So I might be a frontline people and we're gathering stuff, but I want to get I want the regional partnership board or the senior management group or the whatever collaboration, and they're going to wrestle out the stories, and so it's that benefit of getting people to develop that common knowledge, mutual understanding, and respect, and building relationships. So I'll give you an example from Pembrokeshire. So they were doing preventions work, which is quite complex and bitty, and everyone's doing different things. The National Park were doing something, social services were doing something, the health were doing their thing. But the panel had the director of the National Park, Jonathan Griffiths, the director of social services, the cabinet member for social services, the public health person, the third sector director, whatever. So and primary care were there, and but when they start the selection process, they can start to see where other people are coming from. So Tegrin, who was the director of West Pembrokeshire National Park, he picked this story, and you could see people going, "Where's he pick? Oh, where's he pick that story? It's a funny story, isn't it?" But then Tegrin shared why he picked that story. And I'd never seen that about the national park. I didn't realise that was. So then they understand about the national park, and then there was the stories, of course, are first person. They can be very moving. Jonathan Griffiths, the sort of steely director of social services, shed a tear. I've never seen Jonathan cry before. It was lovely. It was human. So it's humanizing the process. So it's fine to get emotional and in deliberation and dialogue. Oliver Escobar up in Edinburgh University says emotions are important in that process. It's not all rational.
Absolutely.
Change is emotional too, isn't it? So and it's really powerful. Yeah. So it does those things. So if you want to build relationships, mutual understanding, genuine co-production, interprofessional working that isn't just tokenistic, shove everybody in a team and hope for the best,
Mm.
then MSc is great. That's what I'd say. It
Absolutely.
shines at that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I can think of examples where I've run panels where, we've invited along the scary funder or the kind of, the council officer who's overseeing the fund with all these kind of, tick boxy requirements and overly, ambitious funding requirements.
Yeah.
And actually, when we've got in the room, they've been the most kind of emotionally driven about looking at these stories and they've said to hell with all of that. This is
That's it.
what really matters is that this person is feeling this, sense of, autonomy or this belonging or that they've made this friend, we've all looked around in the room and thought, gosh, we expected you to come along and say, yes, but how many of these have been converted into this outcome? Or,
Yeah,
and actually, it's broken down a lot of barriers through having that
it
very
has.
emotional connection around what actually
Yeah.
matters here. Why are
What
we?
matters to humanity? The head of children's services in East, she says it's a lifeline to me, the story section panels, because she's so involved in those bureaucratic meetings and decision making. She says it's like just It's a lifeline, she calls it, really, because it connects with the people emotionally and why she came into the job in the first place, really. And I would say that with senior managers, they get demonized sometimes as if they become impersonal, but they're not. They're human beings like anybody else, and they're moved by stories equally. Yeah. So the other thing about stories is human beings are brilliant, aren't they, at understanding stories. So I found that generally with the storytelling work, frontline care workers, the minute you try to feed them jargon like outcome focused practice or positive risk taking or co-production, you can see they glaze over. But you share a story with them and say, "What's going on in that story?" Then they're there. They can see exact. Human beings are really sophisticated story analysts. So again, you get this rich, deep understanding rather than superficial. Trying to, because again, I remember I just speak to social workers where they're trying to fit people into their standardized outcome framework thing, and the outcome start. It's not its best. It can be a good thing, but at its worst, it's like you're saying, "You're 6 today. My mother's just died. Does that make you feel 6 on an emotional scale?" Or I mean, it's like, no, you know what I mean. Not they do that outcome style, but it's there's a danger that
Yes,
you're trying to
very reductive again, can't it?
reductive, and I can't bear it. No, 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 no.
And it may or may not work as a tool with individuals. Sometimes, I've
Oh,
worked
yeah,
with
I'm sure it can.
that kind of has been quite a useful framework. But actually, when you add it, what I find as an evaluator, sometimes an organisation will send you all the kind of scores, and it means
Scores, yeah.
absolutely nothing, does it?
It means nothing.
You can't really tell why the person was a 4 here and a 6 there. What caused it?
No,
Whether they care about it, you can't make any sense
not
of it, can
anything.
you?
Well, that's it. And that's Glenn Roberts, who does the experience-based co-design, says the same. He says, we do all these satisfaction surveys in hospital. 70% of patients are happy with their care. So what? What can you do with that? But he says, no, it's the experiences. It's the little stories. We want the highs and the lows, the emotional touch points, because those are things that we can engage with and we can use them in learning. So the story and learning go together, don't they?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because it gives you some seeds as to what you can actually do about trying to
Yeah, because you can create new
aren't
stories.
having a
That's
good
the
time. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's the thing. It's a bit like appreciative inquiry again. You can dream then about what stories might be. And we've had that with parents. One guy the other day said to me, I'm ready to do my story number 2, which is because he's moved on. Again, the world of outcomes. I hate it where you have all the predetermined outcomes. The minute you meet someone, and then you've determined their outcomes, and that's it. And then
Mm.
you work towards them, and they're much more emergent, and the outcomes sort of unfold, don't they, for people?
Absolutely. And if we are trying to change, it's messy. We might
It's
have
messy.
something
Well,
terrible,
that's the other thing about Ian
something really good.
McGilchrist. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's got to go back to Ian McGilchrist, but he's really good because he says the real world is messy. He says people don't like it messy, and he says he makes the distinction between precision and accuracy.
Mm.
So, and he uses physics, the analogy of physics, to explain this. He says Newtonian physics is really precise. So you can say when Halley's comet's going to come in 2027 or whatever, and it'll come in another 78 years, 3 months and 2 days, 6 hours, and it's that sort of precise. It's lovely. But he says, and that's precise, and it's got its place. But he says, if you really want to understand physics, you've got to do quantum physics, and that's not precise, but it's more accurate. But it's messy and it's fuzzy, and it means when you look at something, you change it, and when something can be in 2 places at the same time, well, that's not right. But that's the nature of stuff, really. And he says, what the world is obsessed with is precision, when what we really need is accuracy in evaluation. And accuracy can be messy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
It's
it's
interesting.
kind of reassuring, isn't it, if we've got some percentages, but if they tell us next to nothing, what's the
Because
point?
I think, no, that's it. They scratch the surface because the world is complex, and that's the way it's got to be. I mean, complexity theory would say that, isn't it, as well?
Absolutely. And so we should probably, as passionate though we are, both are about this approach, we should
Of
probably pause for a moment and say, are there limitations? Are there health warnings? Are there times when
course
you
there are,
couldn't
yeah.
use it? What's your thoughts on that?
When I started using MSC, it was very clear in the guide devised by Rick Davis and Jess Dart, the most significant change technique. And I've spoken with Rick and Jess, and they say, no, it's never intended as a standalone.
Mm.
And it doesn't demonize quants,
No.
quantitative measures and surveys and what it's not trying to do that. It just adds a richness. So there are limitations to it because there are things that you can capture in numbers, aren't there? And they're important things. And so you can get all the lovely experiences of people who've been involved, say in Cardiff, in a community shop, which we've got some lovely stories on. But it's quite useful to know how many people went into the shop, because if you have 3 lovely stories and and that was it for a year. It's like you need to know, and you need, and nice to know whether was it just women going into the shop, was it men? So there's all this place for the quant stuff, and how much was the turnover, and what was this, and so you want it just is there to complement other forms of evaluation, really. But it has this richness, it has this relational quality. It is a relational approach to evaluation, which some evaluations are. They're more extractive. And
Yeah.
it's not saying that you must demonize extractive evaluation, but the two come together. That's what we find. So, and actually, it's useful when we presented evidence to people. When we're trying to get evidence to practice, to have the quantitative and qualitative together is really good. But it is obviously qualitative evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes
So
and
and you could have a limit. So you can't like story selection panels are limited in terms of the number of stories they can.
yes.
So if you said, well, I want 100 stories, what are you going to do with those? I mean, you could, if you trust AI, not many people to shove all the stories into a computer, and that's what some people are trying to do now. They're trying to say we can use AI to analyze the stories and draw out the stuff. But I'm very suspicious of that, and also it bypasses all that relational
Yeah.
benefit, which is at the heart of MSc. Really, this isn't just about analyzing. It is about analyzing what's going on, but it's more than that. I keep saying it, and then when we go back to the benefits, we'll summarize that again.
Sometimes when we've had lots of stories, we've had sort of almost layers of panels. So you might, you know,
Yeah,
you might have a panel that's, I don't know, it might be a group of operational staff, or it might just be other members of your research team, but you kind of meet and, filter out and make some kind of, democratic decisions about which stories you're going to take to perhaps the really big
yes,
panel where
yeah,
you've
we've
managed
done
to
that
get,
too.
a key funder and a couple of commissioners in, so that, it's not just me sitting there going, oh, I like these three stories, they're quite interesting. You have actually, filtered those through perhaps another group of people with lived experience, or, whatever, you've gone through some kind of process to get there, and that can work quite well, I think.
It does work well. Again, in Neath, the parents decided they wanted there was going to be a panel with the director of social services and education and health, and they said they gathered loads of stories because they enjoyed it. They enjoyed the evaluation. Not many people enjoy evaluation, but they enjoyed it. And they said, well, we'd like to select the stories that go to the panel. That's fine. Well, that's why they did that. So they selected the stories, and those went then to the senior managers. But they weren't just senior managers, because that's the other thing. The panels. Sometimes people think the panels, and they should be involved decision makers and people in power. But the dynamic of that group is changed if you have somebody with lived experience in there too. Really, somebody who's a direct, for
Yeah,
want of a better word, a beneficiary, whatever, of the service you're supposed to be providing or whatever,
yeah,
because
absolutely.
they can challenge it. And I give you an example of that was in the story selection process. Andrew Jarrett, who's the director of Neath Talbot Social Services, he was stood by a particular story. So this is the most significant story, in my opinion, as the director of social services. And there was a parent on this other one. And she said, well, I don't. I think this is a more significant story. And he was listening to her, and she was saying, well, it's because of this and because of that. And he said, I'd never seen that. He said, I've never. And he walked, symbolically, he walked and he stood. He said, no, you're right. I'm going to come and stand by your story.
Yeah,
Lovely,
yeah,
lovely,
yeah,
lovely for her, lovely for him. And also, pennies dropped for Andrew, who's a good man. He wants to do the best, but he's got a particular view, and his view was shifted through the panel process, and that's part of the panel process. It's all around oracy, really. It's that
yeah.
you get people to reflect on why they think something, and be listening to other people, open to change their mind, and perhaps And there's no yeah, there's nothing better, really. Is there? The world needs that more than anything now, because everyone's so polarized. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's some really interesting cross kind of reflections here, particularly as you describe that very physical process. I really like that. I've not used that approach myself, where you actually move, people are actually physically moving around the
Yeah,
room.
kinesthetic stuff's great.
Really like that. And actually, I was interviewing just a few weeks ago for this podcast, my colleague Paul Connery, about an approach called deep democracy, which you may well have come across. And that's
Yeah, sounds good.
that's an approach in which you really try to sort of build consensus around decision making through really unearthing the kind of often unspoken conflicts. And they start, Paul described a process where you very much begin with asking people to physically take on their positions within the room, and then you do this thing called I can't say it, a soft shoe shuffle, where you then
Oh,
invite
lovely. I want to know more about this. Yeah.
step aside and someone else might go and stand with them, and you physically kind of move around the room, and in your decision making, ultimately you take a vote, but instead of just letting the majority win, you then give voice to the minority and see if actually
Mhm.
you
Bit
could
like,
move to a joint position where everybody agrees. What are the kind of, if we're going to do this, what would we need to put in step to kind of mitigate? So there's something there really interesting around how we build kind of consensus in groups, and how there's a similarity there. You said earlier about, we actually need to get people to argue
yeah, but
nicely
work
in
towards
order.
consensus. There
Yeah,
is that work towards, and well, it's that same family as consensus decision making, because that's another method which sounds a bit similar to one you just described, deep democracy. But I'd like to know more about that. I'll do
yeah,
that afterwards.
yeah, definitely. Or
Swap.
watch the earlier podcast. So I'll
I
share.
would. I want to watch it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But I'm interested in this point about getting people to argue, because we are all often very nice, aren't we, in this uh,
Very
health,
British.
social care, kind of housing sort of worlds, and people, often don't automatically argue. Some people do, and that can sometimes, needs a bit of management, perhaps in a group setting. And other people are very reluctant to disagree with each other. So how do you get them going, Nick? What are your tips?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because my son's got a Dutch girlfriend, and they're very matter of fact. He says, you say, "Do you like this lamp?" No, it's rubbish. You see, in the British, you wouldn't say that. You'd say, "Oh, it's lovely." And it's not mine. But you wouldn't want to hurt the feelings, would you? You wouldn't want to.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it is this. So actually, that it is really important how we prime people to argue nicely together. And I'll be ever thankful to the folk in Cambridge University in the education department, particularly Neil Mercer and Lynn Dawes, his wife, who set up the Oracy at Cambridge.
Yes. Tell me more
Oh,
about that. Yeah.
because it's all around Oracy. What Neil and his team there in Cambridge are interested in, these kids being able to talk, express themselves, and get up and talk in front of a group of people, reason with people, be open to listening to other people and perhaps changing their mind. And it's all this lovely oracy skills. And he says it's always been marginalized in school curriculum over reading, writing, and arithmetic. So the ability to talk and think well together is sort of seen as something that, well, what's talk? Talk is just people talk, don't they? That's it. You don't need to study talk. We don't need to understand talk, because that's just talk. So and he says no. So what they've worked out is they've looked at kids and the way they talk and learn in groups, and they've noticed there are three ways people talk in groups. So I always explain this to people. I say, because there are three ways when you're a group of people, and that we can talk in one of three ways. And the first way to talk is disputational talk. So disputational talk is like the House of Commons. Brexit's fantastic. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. And people argue.
Yeah.
They've got closed minds. They just try to browbeat each other or humiliate each other into submission. And what they say, Neil is seems to say, nobody learns in that. People just get annoyed and upset. So we don't want that kind of conversation in. That's not the way we're going to talk in the story selection panel. But the more subtle one is the second type of talk. That's called cumulative talk. And cumulative, it's a funny word, I can't say it, I get my tongue back. Cumulative talk is where people are in a meeting and they're all nodding and the images going, oh, very interesting. Yes, great stuff. Yeah. And then you walk out the room and say, what on earth was he on about? What a waste of my time. I could have, there's so much more I could have done this morning. And we've all been there, haven't we, in those meetings where you don't say what you really think. So we say and it's nice to unpick, why don't people say what they really think in a meeting? So the first one to raise with people is, you get extroverts and introverts in a group. And extroverts are lovely people, but they can't help but fill the silence. So introverts don't always get a look in. Doesn't mean they haven't got something to say, but they just don't get an opportunity. So that's the first one. The second one is the imposter syndrome. And all the research says most people have the imposter syndrome to some degree. They always think, I'll be found out, wanting. I'll be found wanting. Even the cleverest people, they're in a meeting and thinking, I might say something stupid and somebody will laugh at me. So some people don't say because they're worried about looking stupid. And then the third one is people are worried about repercussions. Why did you say that in front of social services? You shouldn't have said that. So they're worried about getting told off afterwards. Why did you say about it? So they don't say because they're worried they might get it in the neck.
Yeah.
And then the fourth one is that they were saying earlier, that British thing, like we don't like to say Imogen's so lovely. I wouldn't want to hurt her feelings. I thought she was talking a load of rubbish really, but I didn't want to say anything. So, but we explain that to people, and you can see people laugh because they've all been in those meetings, and then they can relate. And we say we don't want that either. We don't want that kind of talk. So we don't want disputational talk. We don't want cumulative talk. What we want is exploratory talk. And this is what Neil and his team really, and they've got talk rules all around this, and you can Google it and look it up. And
I'll add a link to the
it's really good.
yeah.
Yeah. It's simple, but not simplistic. Because you say, well, in exploratory talk, everybody from the start of the conversation is precious. So it doesn't matter who you are here. We could be a group of people from a care home. It could be the gardener, the cook, the cleaner, a nurse assessor, a manager, a resident, a family visitor. You're all important, and we want to hear what you've got to say. So you can say anything you like in exploratory talk. But there is a but. But you must give a reason why you think it. So I can say, I think the moon's made out of cheese. But I can't say that, you see, in exploratory talk. I'll say, I think the moon's made out of cheese because I saw a film about a man and a dog, and they built a rocket, and they took crackers up to the moon, and there were these cones, and they cut off cones of cheese. So I've given you my reason. And then Imogen, you see, the next person has to, you can't dismiss what I've said. So that's stupid. Of course, the moon's not made out of cheese. Anyone could tell you that. That would be rude, you see. You've got to say, you've either got to agree with me or disagree with me. So you might say, Nick, I agree with you because I saw that film. And actually, there's a series of those films, and there was another one where you were talking about Wensleydale cheese. So I'm telling you, it's not any old cheese, the moon. It's made out of Wensleydale cheese, I bet. Yeah, so you've given your reason. But then somebody else, Peter over there says, well, I don't agree with that. But he can say it. He says, well, sorry, Imogen, sorry, Nick, I want to disagree with you. Because I saw both those films, and I think you'll find they're animated cartoons by Nick Park. They're Wallace and Gromit stories, and it's plasticine, not cheese. So it's a silly example, but I use it as an example to illustrate. Say anything you want, just give us your reason, and nobody's going to be rude and dismissive of that. They'll be respectful of that, but they might challenge it. And what we'd like is you to be open to changing your mind. So you don't have to. There's no pressure to change your mind in exploratory talk, but you are encouraged to listen to other people and be open to perhaps saying, oh, like the director of social services who suddenly listened to the parent and, oh, I see, so change your mind. So that's really important. The other thing is, when you've got a group of people, and I've been like it because I love talking. So, and that you're waiting for a gap, and then when there's a gap, you come in. So Imogen's talking about toffee apples or something. I'm not really interested in toffee apples. Imogen stops, and then I start talking about cheese plants or something, whatever.
Mm.
That you can't do that in exploratory talk. So in exploratory talk, you've got to build on what the last person says. So if you say something about whatever you say, I've got to put my hand up, and the last person speaking picks the next person to speak.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and then that person, so there might be three people with a hand up, and it's the last person speaking that picks the next person to speak. And they might then ideally say you pick the person you've noticed hasn't spoken before, being polite and everything. And also you can make a joke about it because you say if you talk too much, you'll only ever be picked once. So you can't just butt in. You've got to be picked to talk. Which you make a joke about it, but it's nice because people know, don't they, when they go on a bit. And then when the person's picked, they have to make a connection. They say, well, that's interesting, Imogen, you've said that. I agree with you because, or I disagree with you because, or so that's exploratory talk. So we adapt exploratory talk for the MSc story selection panel. So, but we make sure people are really clear on the three ways of talking, and then we put on the wall or on a screen a picture of the Indian metaphor of reality, the elephant. The 6 blind people around an elephant.
Yeah.
So the person's holding the tusk and says it's a spear. The person holding the tail says no, it's not. It's a rope. The person holding the leg says it's a pole. And then we say, that's us. And what we want to see is the elephant in the room, really. And it means we want to hear all your perspectives, however opposite they are. A pole and a spear are quite different things, but let's listen. And so you really set the tone. And then as a facilitator, your job really is just to make sure people follow the ground rules of exploratory talk, really. And you encourage that. It's kindly correcting and not challenging one of the Rupert Hyam, who's one of the academics involved in it. He's at UCL now, but he He says dialogue learning, he calls it. It's more than just talking. It's about valuing other people because they really matter and seeking out and learning from the differences between us.
Yeah.
So I always put that up as a quote as well, because it isn't, we are going to talk, but we're actually going to care about each other too. We're going to care, and we're going to love it when we disagree, which
Yeah.
again, people say that's, I've had social workers say, I never say what I really think because they always say I'm being negative. So I never, that's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Can't say what.
And our point is we've deliberately, deliberately invite a diverse group of people to look at these stories. It's like you talked earlier about let's invite a nurse, let's invite a social worker,
Yeah.
let's invite the guy from the national parks. We're like deliberately inviting these people to say, you don't have to stick within your national parks head.
No.
You can feel free to shed a tear or go off on another tangent. You just be yourself, respond as you want. But we've
Yeah.
deliberately invited all these viewpoints into the room because we want to really look at
Diverse.
the elephant from every angle, don't we? We don't want to
We
all
do.
go, oh, here's the elephant, right? Jobs are good enough.
Yeah, that's it. Job's done. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, it's terrible. And
yeah.
people enjoy it. They enjoy the dialogue. They say this is really. I've always found a panel when people talk well together.
Mm,
People love talking, and they like to talk well together, and they get frustrated when talks. Because often I've had those consultation events, and you get everyone, and everyone's all excited, and we've got service users from learning disability, and then we've got older people there, and the director, and everyone starts, and somebody says something that upsets someone, and then somebody gets defensive, and then the whole thing can fall to pieces. And you think, oh my gosh, when's it going to end? Quick,
yeah.
when's tea break?
Yeah.
That's it.
Absolutely. And obviously, the whole of my podcast series is, based around this thinking about change. It's about change talk. So I'm really interested in, how change happens, obviously at lots of different levels, whether that's individuals, groups, organizations, communities, systems, and obviously also how we kind of measure that, understand it, learn from it. And so I'm just wondering, I suppose firstly, whether there are some examples of change happening in the moment that you've witnessed within those kind of panel processes. Can you think of times where there have been actual transformations that, hopefully will have gone beyond the room, in terms of people's thinking or the relationships that are built?
You you can tell when people. I mean that's it's very interesting about learning when you want, because the educationists are keen on learning, and sometimes when you're busy social, you think, oh no, it's more about acting and doing stuff. They say no, because if you genuinely learn, that will influence your actions. So
Mm.
learning by itself just leads to different outcomes, really. Because when your mind is changed on a certain way of, you will act in a certain. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So, because sometimes people say, "Oh, it's a lot of talking, isn't it?" But through the talk, people change, and you can see that, because the other thing that the educators say to us is, learning isn't just an intellectual thing; it's an emotional thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's a quote attributed to Aristotle, but it isn't Aristotle, apparently. They always hook things on his name. It's educating the heart without educating the mind is no education. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all, which is quite a nice line. So for really deep learning, like a deep democracy, it needs to engage people's head and the heart. So the rational part that we think, but also the emotions are connected. And it's the same as Oliver says in deliberation. Head and heart are both important in that process, really. And I've seen that, because you can tell when people are moved,
Yes.
when they're affected by stories, and when they talk about that and actually start to put a language around that, around significance, about the significance, then you can see change is happening in people. And obviously, when you do the kinesthetic stuff, where you have people move around, you can actually see people move positions, and that is lovely to see when that happens. People don't always, but when it happens, you can see it really clearly.
Yes.
And also, it's after there's often a buzz after a story selection panel as well. So we did one and it was interesting because the stories are gathered by an OT in an inpatient stroke ward, and they were quite tame little stories of what had changed. Somebody, the meals had changed, and something about, and they were a bit worried these stories would be a bit boring, really. Yeah, that's what they were worried about. And they invited the consultants, neurologists, whatever, and they'd got the doctors, the ward doctors, they got the catering people, and they went through this process, but they really gelled as a team, and you could see, because one of the things that came from and they understood each other. So one of the things that came up in the stories was the doctors could be a bit more personable, couldn't they? And there was, of course, there was a doctor in the story selection panel, and he said, "I'd love to be more personal, but I can't. He can't be really." And he said, "I just," and he explained why, and you could see people huddle around him really, and so you could see changes in the dynamic, and it's the same with Neath. Because if you want me to give an example, the Neath Port Talbot work has been really powerful because it really has changed the dynamic between parents and the powers that be, the policing local authority, really, who in previous life were sort of policing bad parenting, really, weren't they? Sort of, but now through that part, not saying it's all down to MSC because they've done other things, but MSC has really helped oil the machine of that because they're talking and thinking together and reasoning, and it's changed the culture. They've halved the number of kids that they take into care, which is massive.
Wow,
It is massive. And again,
that's
it's not all down to MSC. MSC is just
no.
one of the little cogs in the wheel because they've set up these parent cafes and they've set a bit like Tim Fisher has done in Camden
Yes,
communities. Yeah,
having
same sort of stuff.
yeah,
It's deeply respectful of people.
yeah.
When you respect people and cherish people, it brings out the best in people. People grow, don't they? Yeah. So I'm
Absolutely.
going off on a tangent, but
Really there about, yeah, that point about changing culture.
it's central. I say MSC is about culture change as much as it is about evaluation.
Massive. I remember doing a panel a number of years ago. We'd done a most significant change process in Wigan. We were evaluating a whole load of different initiatives they've done around dementia-friendly communities, and we'd had a couple of other panels. We ended up at this kind of final panel, and we had, all sorts of people. We'd got counsellors and quite senior people from the hospital along, and so on and so forth. And one of the stories was from somebody who themselves was living with dementia and had become part of a group which was challenging and going round and assessing the accessibility
Yeah,
of different environments. And they were talking about that role and some of the changes they'd had. And you could see around the room, everybody's kind of was quite, some people weren't aware of this group and hadn't really thought about the idea of having people actually living with dementia coming around their services and saying whether or not they were accessible. It was like a penny really dropped for them.
yeah, revelation. Yeah,
Yeah, and what you saw then in the later stories is those some of those individuals started to then question why there wasn't somebody living with dementia as part of this story. Someone had come from
yeah,
a doctor's surgery and say we're doing all of this, and one of the quite senior people in the room would be saying, well, then if they asked this group of people living with dementia what they think about it, so you
yeah.
start to get this kind of challenge from within, and I kind of thought, gosh, as an evaluator, if I'd gone off and written a really nice report and said, oh, there's this group of people and made a recommendation that everybody needs to think about inviting this group to their services, A, nobody would have read the report. I'm not kidding
No,
myself.
that's the key thing. That's what I think.
B, they would have just skimmed through it and gone, yeah, 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 yada, yada. But because they'd actually kind of really got into the experience of this story, they then actually started to challenge each other about it. And I didn't even need to write a report then. I mean,
No, that's
don't
it.
say
Because
that out of
you've lit
laziness.
a fire, really. You've lit a fire. Yeah,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
said well, you need to advertise the fire, really. And I think sometimes because it's deeply human,
Mm,
and yeah, and
yeah.
it's a bit like stories around a campfire, isn't it? It's how we make sense. It's how we belong and connect, and so the storytelling nature is so important. So yeah, yeah, and we have seen change. I mean, again, I'll give you another example, but do you want to do a separate question about those?
No, no, carry on. No, carry on. I mean, I'm just reflecting on sort of, really what you've learned from MSc in relation to change, but throw in any examples you like.
Yeah, so well, a nice example is, and again, sort of where it's it goes beyond what you can do with the usual metrics, is the example of a community-based and co-production approach to stroke and head injury rehab.
Mhm.
So in Wales, we have this thing called Bevan Commission, and they fund innovative stuff in health, and there's a Bevan exemplar in an Iron Bevan Health Board, and it's a different way of doing stroke and head injury rehab. So the traditional way is obviously on the ward, and there's lots of measuring, and you can imagine it, a physiotherapist doing the gait and this and that, and psychologists doing their various measures. But what they've done is they've taken the rehab out into the community. So and they've got people, and they've set up what they call a recovery college. It sort of follows along the lines of the mental health recovery college. The idea is there's all sorts of community-based, open access stuff that people can attend. The clinicians will go along, but then they're not. they're not going for appointments. It's so there's like an understanding brain injury group, and then there's a peer support group of parents of children. So they call it like the spaghetti meatballs model. It's like there's all these little things you can put your fork into. And they said none of these measures work. We've got a guy called Dave, for example, Dave, and he's a retired he's a policeman, and he had a stroke, and he's devastated. He was probably quite a macho policeman, and now he's this less, version 2 of himself. And he says that's what we're discovering. People are discovering version 2 of themselves. So Dave set up a breakfast club, and other people are coming to the breakfast club. And they've got an MSc story. It talks about how he set that up and how they're all going on a bus trip to see Les Miserables in London. And they said we can't put that into an outcome star. It doesn't. It doesn't. So they've gathered the stories, and it's been really powerful in shaping the culture within the NHS there, because some people think, oh, it's very fancy, it's all very nice, these little community things, peer support, but it's really powerful because the stories really show the richness of the impact. And it's not just for the practitioners, the changes. Sorry, for the people with lived experience. It's the practitioners too. So there was somebody who worked in the local authority who was trying to set up something and struggling really and not getting referrals from health because they didn't know each other and this and that. But they iteratively approached the leisure centre, and the leisure centre was scared about having people with stroke because they said, what if somebody dies and will they sue us and all this? So they iteratively, collectively sorted things, and now they've got this lovely activity going on, and communication has improved, and it's really complex. It's a web of unfolding complexity and loveliness, really, and everybody's benefiting. So the leisure people are benefiting, the leisure service people, the clinicians are benefiting because they're getting, and the patients and the family carers are, and it's lovely. And you couldn't capture that in any other way
No.
than in a story. And it's complex, and you wouldn't want to dissect the story because it speaks for itself. I think, why do you need to dissect it? Just look at that, just read that story. You don't need, you can start to thematically analyze it if you want. But again, the important thing is, look, this is making a difference. And can we have other stories like this, please? Because that's what people are saying now. We need to create more stories like this.
I think that's a really nice example of I've certainly used MSc in evaluations where, it's the only real meaningful way to capture that kind of trickle effect, the way in which, a lot of these projects, especially when it involves a community or a whole kind of network of organizations, it's an organism with a life of its own, isn't it? And it's, again, you wouldn't even know where to look if you didn't start with a storytelling approach. It's like, you go in here and suddenly it turns out this has opened out something, this person, that person, they found out about this, they've set this thing up. It's, it's all kind of grown out of this starting point, and there's no way you could kind of capture that
box it
without
in.
that kind of
It's messy, but it's wonderful. There's a lovely story in Pembrokeshire called A Beautiful Life. And it was a guy who obviously had adverse childhood experiences, and basically his life had gone downhill. He'd had relationships not work. And you see the burdens he was bearing. No wonder he wasn't coping very well. And he'd neglected his health. And his story of change started with just a little phone conversation to a sort of community organisation who did one thing, and then that led to another thing, and then somehow that led to another thing, and then somebody did this and somebody did that, and it's just amazing. It's just, but it's unfolded like a flower, really, and the only way to capture that is in the story. You couldn't do it. You gather it any other way, and it shows you the sophistication to me of that story, particular story of community-based work, really, because sometimes people think third sector organisations, community connectors, that's all very sweet, isn't it? But it's not like cutting-edge social work practice or clinical nurse. But it's really sophisticated and nuanced and gentle and clever.
Yeah, and there's something there, isn't there? We were reflecting in a previous podcast about, support using psychological methods to support individuals to change. There's something there, isn't there, about often when you speak to people, it was little seeds that were sown all this way back in time, and just gradually over time, it's kind of ballooned into something, that little conversation that happens, and it's just the start of a journey. And there's.
Well, this one, you could see one of the things, he wasn't getting any health care, and he got ulcers on his legs and everything in his early 60s. And But what came out of his story was he was deeply embarrassed, really, and he didn't want to let the GP down. He didn't want to, because he felt that he'd failed, and that's yeah. So where do you start there? Somebody's got such a low starting point, and it was a little act of kindness, really, that was the key,
Absolutely.
and seeing the first person behind the label, really,
Absolutely. Yeah, no.
which is your Joseph Rowntree.
It is indeed. And
See
that
the person behind the label or diagnosis.
brings us, yeah, that because of course we kind of got to know each other, Nick, didn't we? All I was gosh, it was a while back, wasn't it? It must be well over a
Yeah.
decade ago. But through your work to then kind of, what do you want to say a little bit more about it? But I was involved in the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, A Better Life program, which was a whole range of different research, action learning kind of projects, which really looked at how we can best support older people with high support needs. And I was involved in trying to sort of draw out the final messages of
Yeah,
that
very well,
program,
very skillful. You did
and
it.
then you kind of ran off with it, didn't you, in terms of
Yeah,
implementation? Yeah,
getting it into practice. Well,
yeah.
that's what we're about, because the program I work for is Deep, developing evidence-enriched practice,
Mhm.
and we're based in Wales, but originally developed with Scotland, so Emma Miller up in Scotland, and so it was a Scottish Welsh project, and it was trying to say, how do we get research like the Joseph Rowntree A Better Life program into practice? And we took a co-production approach. So we learned some of these dialogic ways of storytelling ways of presenting evidence, and then dialogic ways of exploring evidence, and that's what led to me coming to understand MSc. Because the minute I saw it, I thought, gosh, that's similar, because it's not using research evidence directly. It's not like crafting a piece of research evidence and then getting people to explore it dialogically, like you might do in a community of inquiry, because that's another method we use, which is good for that. But it is gathering evidence, because it's evidence into practice, because what you're doing is gathering lived experience evidence or practitioner knowledge. That's evidence, isn't it? It's not being bundled up into a research paper, but it's evidence, and it's getting it into practice through story and dialogue. So that's how I made the connection, really. I sort of, and as we've gone along, we've sort of hoovered up. So that's why I like your deep democracy. That might be another thing especially as our program's called Deep.
Yeah, absolutely.
But anything that's story and dialogue focused, I think is really powerful. So we're funded by Social Care Wales at the moment. So again, funding is always tenuous, isn't it? But they've embedded a lot of the stuff, and we do run training on most significant change and what we call magic tragic moments, which is an adapted form of experience-based co-design, and we do community of inquiry. And we do little workshops on well-being, how you just cherish other people, really, and make them feel good. Because if you want anybody to engage in whether it's sharing their evidence or learning from evidence, you've got to do it in a kindly way, haven't you, really? That is respectful of people. It's
Yeah,
because the world's so harsh.
yeah.
It's so often, isn't it? The news is harsh to watch. And one of the surveys that really struck me was the NHS staff survey. It was 2021 when I last looked through it, but it was like 43% of staff feel worn out at the end of their shift. And there were huge figures like that. And I thought, and we're trying to get people to engage with evidence and do this. And it's just another thing piled on top of them. And evaluation can be like that, can't it? It's like another thing. Oh, God.
Absolutely.
It's another thing we've got to do. And
Yeah,
so if we're going to do evaluation and get people involved in it, then let's do it in a kindly way that actually is it enjoyable. So you never
yeah,
think evaluating parents in child safeguarding would be an enjoyable activity for the parents. But whether they speak positively about social services or negatively about social services, they've had their voice heard, and that's
yeah. I
and
think
not being shoehorned into some kind of outcome star, really.
absolutely. I think that's
Gemma, the one I mentioned right at the start, the
yeah.
one who said to be continued, she's really big, Gemma, and she'd eat social workers for breakfast before. She's got quite a history of eating social workers alive. And, and I just imagine going up to her with, I've got this Edinburgh Wellbeing Scale. Can I just do it? She'd tell you where to put it, really. Yeah, so. But she's happy to tell her story. And unfortunately for us, it's a very positive story because, again, it's an example where the local authority or the social worker believed in her and saw something in her that she didn't see in herself
Mm.
and brought out the best in her. And it's been transformative for her and for the parents she works with, really. And it's lovely. So, So
Yeah.
that's probably it, really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it is. I think, yeah, it's a really nice place to end because I do feel there's a responsibility now more than ever, isn't there, for those of us involved in evaluation to create, really spaces that are themselves kind of these liminal spaces that are, need to be constructive and to create, opportunities for reflection, learning,
Yeah.
relationships to build, and people to be genuinely listened to. And I think,
Listened to and moved.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's one of the things about storytelling, because I like digital storytelling, and people get their hankies out. Oh, that was a lovely story, wasn't it? But I think no, you've got to go beyond that. From being moved to moving, you've got to go to action, and you need the dialogue. So, and that's lovely about that. It's getting people, it's engaging people's minds and their hearts, but it's taking them into action really to change things. It's a social pedagogy, isn't it? The head, heart, and hearts, and MSc touches on all three of those. Yeah.
I love that. We'll leave it at that point of being taking people from moved to moving,
Yeah,
moving to yeah, yeah. I love that. Thank you so much, Nick. It's been an absolute joy. Really, really
it's
appreciate.
always lovely to talk with you, Imogen. You're great. Thanks for all your help and support over the years, really. So.
Thank you very much.